Thanks for joining me. Today I've got Dr. Jeff Iorg, president of Gateway Seminary, who's going to be joining me to talk through issues that are challenges for pastors, how to overcome some of those issues. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. So welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm very excited this week to have Dr. Jeff Iorg here with us from Gateway Seminary. Kind of introduce yourself, your history and ministry, talk about your family a little bit.
Yeah, glad to do so. And thanks for inviting me to be on the podcast today. I've had a long career of ministry leadership. I started out as a children's pastor and then moved to become a pastor of a more traditional style church in the Midwest. But then in 1989, I left there and moved to Portland, Oregon to plant a church. And I thought that would be my life's work. But a few years later, new direction came and I transitioned to executive director of the Northwest Baptist Convention. And then 20 years ago, became the president of Gateway Seminary. And so I've been a pastor, I've been a staff pastor, a church planter, a denominational executive, and now a seminary president. So over the last 45 years, that's been the trajectory I followed.
I did not know within that children's pastor was part of your background.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that immensely. It was both a training ground and a ministry opportunity when I was in college. And so It was a good and fulfilling time. You also asked about my family. I'm married to Ann. We've been married for 43 years. I have 3 adult children, 2 sons and a daughter. My daughter is actually married to a church planting pastor who himself was just elected the executive director of the Wyoming Baptist Convention. So their trajectory is now following somewhat the same one that my wife and I did as we moved from church planting into that leadership role a number of years ago. And both my sons are businessmen and both vital Christians and very much involved in supporting ministry. And so good family connections, and then 5 grandchildren. And we'll just stop there because that could fill up the rest of the podcast if I start telling grandchildren stories.
Understood. I'm not at that point yet. I also have 2 boys and a girl. My youngest is a senior in high school right now. But when you see kids tracking in the same direction, my middle son, my middle child, my younger son started actually here at SBU, and he's majored in Christian ministry. And so to see that track, it's just exciting
It is exciting. Good for you.
But my oldest is married and no grandkids yet, but I'm coming to find out just how much grandkids can fill up a lot of that time, because it's just an exciting part of life. So I'll tell you what, so typically the couple of things we talk about on this podcast really have to do with getting at the heart of where struggles lie and how to overcome those struggles in the lives of pastors. And so the question I usually ask is, talk about the top 2 or 3 challenges you see in ministry, whether they're things you've personally seen or experienced, or in your capacity working with pastors at Gateway. What are the things that you've seen and heard from them?
Well, the number one challenge for pastoral leaders today is to stay focused on the mission and to really identify what they mean by that phrase, the mission, and then to give themselves wholeheartedly to it. Most churches, their mission is the Great Commission in the spirit of the Great Commandment. And however you want to say that in plainer language to get away from the insider jargon I just used is usually helpful. But it's the Great Commission in the spirit of the Great Commandment. That's what churches do. The problem is there are so many competing agendas coming against pastoral leaders today. People want the church to be engaged politically. They want it to prioritize social justice concerns. They want the church to adopt a theological perspective and promote that at all costs. They want the church to get sidetracked on something other than the mission of the Great Commission in the spirit of the Great Commandment. And so I think the number one challenge for pastoral leaders today is to resist all the pressures and all the temptations, and quite frankly, sometimes the comforts of pursuing these alternative missions, and to stay riveted on reaching people with the gospel, making disciples of them, living in community that demonstrates love for people, making a real difference in that regard. That's what we're about. And so, honestly, that's the number one challenge. And when I hear pastors talking to me about being pressured to get involved in politics or promote any one of a dozen social justice issues, or find themselves being challenged to advocate certain theological perspectives or conclusions or convictions and make that the mission. I hear pastors talking about all these different things. It really comes back to eliminating all the noise and focusing narrowly on the mission. So, Bill, that's the number one challenge I see for people in leadership today, especially people in pastoral leadership.
Yeah. So even as I hear you talking about that, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is trying to weigh out and just wonder, when I think about those pressures coming in on a pastor, when I think about those pressures coming on a church, how often are those external pressures coming from the outside versus how often are those internal pressures from people within the church saying, we need to speak into this? What are your thoughts there?
Quite frankly, most of the time, I think the pressures are greater inside the church, where you have members and other attenders pressuring you to go a certain direction or to emphasize a certain topic or to be on a certain theme. Pastoral leaders do not typically have people outside their church trying to come in and set their agenda. Now, people from outside the church are often creating cultural pressure points that pastors may feel obligated to respond to, but it's not the same as having church members trying to get you onto their particular issue or their particular challenge. Most of the time when my phone rings and it's a troubled pastor, he's not telling me about something that happened in their community that impacted them, although that does occasionally happen. Most of the time it's, my elders want to emphasize this political candidate. What do I do about that? Or my deacons are pressuring me to take a stand on this issue and to make that and to preach messages on that and make that the focus of our church. Or I have a group of people in my church who really want us to get involved in, like, for example, abortion politics or something related to that. And so it's pressure points that come from within congregations that are oftentimes more difficult for pastors because of all the relational dynamics, financial considerations, and personal and interpersonal pressures. All of it comes more from inside than from outside. And that's coming from someone who lives in California, where, let me tell you, there's a tremendous amount of external pressure put on us. But really, that external pressure doesn't control us or influence us nearly as much as the internal pressures we feel from our own constituents.
So that's one of the areas that I was thinking about in terms of external pressures. But even as we started talking about it a little bit more, I also find myself wondering about conventional pressures, if I can put it that way. The idea of within SBC life, are there pressures that build that both pastors are feeling from one another, that also, our congregants are seeing those things, are being influenced by those things, and how do those pressures play in?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because there is a lot of what I call tribalism right now in the Southern Baptist Convention. There's theological tribes, and there are social justice issue tribes, and there are political tribes, and they are all vying for pastors' attention, loyalty, and influence. And it takes a tremendous amount of personal discipline and mission discipline to stay focused on, the work of God and the discipleship, the evangelism, discipleship, and caring for people that's a part of local church ministry. And even within our movement, these groups are really appealing to pastors because they know how influential pastors are and what a difference pastors can make. So it takes a tremendous amount of leadership resolve to even withstand those kind of pressures from inside our movement.
So with that being said, what are the things that you see as most beneficial in helping a pastor to navigate some of that? Because really, a big part of what the Blair Center is about helping pastors to steer clear of burnout. And it strikes me that dealing with these pressures on a regular basis, and like you're talking about, not staying mission focused, could easily facilitate some of that burnout. So what are the things that you would see that facilitate staying focused where the focus needs to be?
Well, the first thing is actually a quality that I've come to value very highly in ministry leaders, and that is the quality of personal security.
Hmm.
Secure leaders are not pursuing popularity, and they aren't trying to satisfy other people so they can feel good about themselves. Secure leaders know who they are, who God made them to be, what God assigned them to do, and they're willing to pursue that without so much distraction from what so many other people are saying to them or about them. I've watched a number of leaders implode over the years, and one of the commonalities has been personal insecurity. They were driven to behaviors that shocked us.
Yeah.
Why? Because they were trying to satisfy some deep longing they have for respect, for recognition, for notoriety, for pleasure, rather than being secure in who they are and confident in that. A number of years ago, a man said to me, the security of the believer is not a doctrine for after you die, it's a doctrine for right now. And I thought, what? I thought security of the believer was once saved, always saved. It was a doctrine about heaven. He said, no. And then he made this great statement. He said, security of the believer means that you are as secure in Jesus Christ this minute as you will ever be in eternity.
Yeah.
Man, that was so enlightening to me because I realized, wait a minute, I don't have to pursue accomplishment in order to gain security. I have it in my relationship to God through Jesus Christ. He has secured me. He's given me identity. He's given me
Yep.
satisfaction and contentment. He's given me life and mission. Therefore, I don't have to pursue that in other ways. I can enjoy it in my relationship with Him. And so security is so vital for every ministry leader because when you have it, you find yourself with a peace and confidence and satisfaction that can't be taken from you. When you don't have it, you find yourself chasing after all these different things, including public accolades, personal satisfaction, pats on the back from other people, popularity that comes through amassing social media followers, and all these kinds of things. You find yourself in this endless pursuit of trying to find something satisfying that's driven by a deep insecurity. So I think number one, I would say, is finding security in Jesus Christ and letting that security start impacting the way you decide about your daily life and about the way you do your ongoing ministry.
Yeah, I don't think I could agree more. You hit on a word in the middle of that's the one that resonates for me, and it's probably connected to not only my background just in psychology, but where my research lies. I spend a lot of time thinking about identity, and specifically a sense of our faith identity, who we are in Christ, who we are as individuals, totally bought in. And it's in psychology terms, it's the idea of identity achievement, that sense of I have done some living and I have come to recognize the fullness of who I am. And in a faith perspective, the idea of I have recognized myself in my fallenness. I recognize who I am in the grace of God and being saved, and nothing takes that away. The amount of social media followers I have doesn't change that. It doesn't increase that. And it really comes back to the passages we see when we recognize that we are adopted children of God, that we're given the right to be called that in John 1:12. We're talked about as being adopted as sons. And I'm really thinking of the Galatians 3 passage more than I think it's in Romans, the other passage, but I'm really thinking of the Galatians 3 passage where it talks about our adoption. It's really getting at the heart of who we are, that work that the Holy Spirit does in us, and that we continue to grow in through sanctification. When that is our focus, when that's our hallmark, that's where that security you're talking about comes from. But it doesn't stop us from living in a world where all these distractions are and can so easily feed into a sense of insecurity that we're, I think, primed for in a lot of ways in a fallen world.
You're exactly right. Identity is the quest of this generation, and we've found it in Christ. That is our identity. But now learning to actualize that, where it becomes a sense of security that it influences our daily functionality, that's what I'm appealing for. And I know that when I am operating as a leader out of a sense of security in my relationship with God and in his call and direction and placement in my life, so many of these other distractions and competing agendas just fall by the wayside because I'm no
Yep.
longer compelled to pursue them in order to gain the identity that other people want to bestow upon me. I really don't need to have their theological or their political or their social identity thrust upon me in order to validate who I am. I can be who I am and interface with these things without a sense of compulsion that if I don't satisfy them, there's something wrong with me.
Yeah.
Security just makes a huge difference. Now, that's just one thing, but I think it's a foundational thing to preventing burnout and establishing a very narrowly focused mission commitment to leadership.
So what else would you add into that?
Well, practically speaking, I think a second thing that relates to this issue of burnout is self-care. I heard that phrase the first time and I reacted very negatively to it. I heard the speaker say that phrase and I thought, I didn't sign up for self-care. I signed up to sacrifice myself. I signed up to give myself away. But he made but as he taught, I reflected more positively on his presentation. And I concluded that while he didn't use these words, I concluded that my struggle was he was saying self-care, but I was hearing self-indulgence. I think the Bible speaks very strongly against self-indulgence. But self-care is not self-indulgence. Self-care is doing what I need to do to make sure that I can continue to give myself away for the good of others. And Bill, let me just give you one simple, silly illustration. I fly a lot in my job speaking around the country. And a great illustration of the difference between self-care and self-indulgence happens on every flight during the pre-flight instructions. It's that
you're going exactly where I was going to go.
It drops out of the sky. You know, they always say, if the mask drops, put it on yourself first before you help the child or the senior adult who needs your assistance. And I thought, well, is that because we want the weaker people to die? No, it's because if I don't take care of myself first, I won't be able to take care of anybody else that's with me. This is self-care, not self-indulgence. It's taking care of yourself, not for your own benefit or so that you'll feel better or have more comfort or be richer or anything like that, but it's taking care of yourself so that, and that so that is very important, you can take care of other people. And as I reflected on that illustration, I thought, man, that makes so much sense to me. So I've started teaching about how to practice self-care by making sure that you care for yourself spiritually and you care for yourself emotionally and you care for yourself physically and relationally, so that in these areas you're strengthening yourself. And again, not for your own benefit or for your own comfort or for some pampering that you think you deserve. No, that's self-indulgence. But self-care is, I'm going to do these things spiritually, emotionally, physically, relationally. I'm going to do these things so that I can then exhaust myself again serving other people and then replenish myself so that I can give myself away. That cycle seems very healthy to me, as opposed to a self-indulgent cycle, which ultimately leads to frustration and failure.
The whole conversation we were having about security and identity is foundation. This whole conversation is about making sure we can then live based out of that and take care of others. I couldn't agree more. That's exactly what it's about. It's so funny. I started kind of chuckling a little bit. The illustration you gave about the airplane is the same thing I talk about when I talk about self-care in my classes.
That's awesome.
It's 100% on point. So I tell you what, we spent a good bit of time talking about this issue and staying missional and what to do about that and how to make sure that we're able to stay missional. What else? What other challenges would you see that we need to talk about today?
Well, the second big area that I hear concerns expressed from particularly lay people who are having problem with ministry leaders and ministry leaders who are struggling with lay people as well is relational breakdown. A few years ago, down-to-earth deacon called me and said, "Hey, listen, I wonder if you could help me with our pastor." And I said, "Well, what could I do?" He said, "Well, he's a fine preacher. He's passionate about the Lord. His theology is really good and sound, and we like him." And I thought, okay, what's the problem? That sounds pretty good. He said, "But Dr. Iorg," he said, "our pastor is school smart, but he's street stupid." And I said, "What does that mean?" He goes, "He doesn't know how to work with people. He just doesn't understand the basics of just relating to people and how to connect with them and how to work with them. He just doesn't get it." And I thought, man, that's a great way to express it. And so what I think another big learning area for a lot of ministry leaders is just understanding the relational skills necessary to do ministry effectively. And especially for those of us, and I'm in this category, that are fairly driven and task oriented and like to get things done and like to check my boxes and keep things moving. It's a challenge to learn the relational skills needed to be engaged with people meaningfully. Now, fortunately, God put some people on the earth, like my wife, who is naturally gifted in relationships, and it comes to her as just a part of who she is as a spiritually gifted Christian. Not so much for me. So I've had to learn the relational skills necessary for ministry leadership. And this podcast is too short to go into how to do that in great detail, but you can basically do it in a couple of broad categories. One, pay attention to the people who are relationally gifted around you and learn from them.
Yep.
Second, don't be afraid to actually read books on relational health and emotional intelligence and connecting with people and how to do that more effectively. Things like learning effective listening skills and dialogical methodologies and how to actually have conversations that matter. These things are skills that can be learned. And then this is the hardest one to say, not only pay attention to the people who are good at it and do some intentional learning and study about how to do it better. But here's the third one. Learn from your critics on this issue. When I first started out in ministry, I had some people that confronted me pretty strongly about my relational deficiencies, and my response to them was not very kind. I was very dismissive of them. But looking back on it, I realized that they were God's instrument in my young formative years trying to point out deficiencies in my life so I will change. Now, they were doing it in the wrong ways some days, and they didn't always approach me the right ways, and I get all that. Yeah. But bottom line, they were saying something to me that I needed to hear. And so if you can find the grace to sort through some of these criticisms, especially about your relational deficiencies, and understand what's really happening here and what do I need to do to change, then perhaps God can use even those difficult relationships to help you to get better. So these are some ways you can work on it. Pay attention to the people who do it well, do some intentional study to figure out how you can be more relationally connected, and then learn from these critics, people who are pointing out how you're not getting it done. No, they might not be right on everything, but there might be a core they're telling you that really you do need to hear. I did. Yeah. And when I started paying attention to that, it really helped me become a better ministry leader.
Yeah, so it's interesting to me. I'm at a place where I've recorded several of these podcasts, and in just about every one, relational issues has come up. That is one of the things that's a core that needs to be worked on. A couple different times I've talked about it. One of the classes that I've taught back when I was at Southwestern Seminary actually was a class on relationships in ministry. And one of the books that we did in there always stands out to me. It was a book by a guy named Ron Susek called Firestorm. And it's talking about how churches end up having a meltdown and firing a pastor, that kind of idea. And over and over and over again, those issues are less frequently about theological shortcomings in the pastor and more frequently about relational issues between that pastor and his church.
Can I tell you that for 10 years, I was the state executive in the Northwest Baptist Convention, and I could not name one pastor that was ever terminated over a theological difference. Yeah. Most lay people will tolerate a wide range of theologies as long as there's orthodoxy in the core of them. Yep. But what the breakdowns most always were related to was relationships. There were a few
Yep.
times when the pastor did catastrophically bad things like moral failure or some kind of fraud or something like that. But those were pretty rare also. More common, it was the fact the pastor doesn't know how to conduct meetings. He doesn't know how to have relationships. He gets angry easily. He doesn't know how to handle conflict. He doesn't know how to compromise or negotiate on non-essentials. He's too rigid on things that don't matter. He's disrespectful
Yep.
in his communication. He says things publicly that ought not be said in those contexts. These are the kinds of things that cause pastors to be terminated. Very rarely theology, not very common, some dramatic failure. It's more all
Yep.
of these things in the middle about relational breakdowns and how they occur.
Well, and even as we're talking about it right now, I'm realizing afresh the deep intersection between relational issues and security we were talking about earlier. If
Right.
you know who you are in Christ and you're operating from that solid foundation, then relational issues become much easier. It becomes easier to hear from someone that they disagree with you, or that they're frustrated about something, or they really wanted blue carpet in the fellowship hall instead of red. And how could you possibly order that? That all of that kind of stuff, it becomes less challenging when you've got that solid foundation in place.
Right.
So as we think about these couple of issues, and we've talked through some of the ways to deal with that, which I agree with you. I don't think we have time to really flesh out all the different ways to work on relationship stuff. I do think there are some great resources out there that I probably just need to cultivate a list of what those are and get them up on the website for folks. What are some resources that come to mind for you as best resources to help pastors with both of these issues, with a sense of security and with a sense of greater relational understanding that could be a benefit to their pastor?
Well, I don't want to be self-serving here for you or for me, but I think one of the foundational issues is formal training for ministry leadership.
Yeah.
When you go into college or seminary, one of the things that happens is you're forced to study things you would not study on your own, and you're forced to look at blind spots you don't even know you have. Particularly in the seminary curriculum, we have at Gateway a course at the beginning called Foundations for Ministry, where we address these very issues. We do it in a small group setting. No class can have more than 12 students. And
Nice.
we focus on these core personal issues and help students lay out a personalized growth plan that they want to experience during seminary of how to resolve some of these issues. Another thing we do is we have a 1-year long ministry internship called theological field education, where students are working in a church setting and working in a seminary setting on these personal growth issues over a period of a year. Now, it's in the context of doing ministry. They have a covenant of learning that involves ministry that they're supposed to accomplish during that year. So it's not a group counseling session. No, it's a ministry project, but with personal reflection along the way that forces you to learn and grow. And one of the things we do is we require every student to have a lay consultation committee of people in their ministry setting who will sit down with them once a month and give them honest feedback on who they are as a ministry leader, and not only what they're doing in performing ministry, but how they're interfacing personally and relationally through that process. Those lay consultation teams can be very helpful in helping ministry leaders to grow in these particular areas. Now, this is not to say that everyone has to be in college or seminary to keep growing in these areas, but what it does say is if you're already past those phases of life or you don't have access and can't access them, that's fine. But you must take some intentional steps to grow in these areas. Get into an accountability relationship with some people who will tell you the truth about how you're doing ministry. Decide to read one book a month for the next year or two on the interpersonal aspects of ministry, and contact a school like one of ours and ask for some help to find those resources. Get involved with someone who's really good at relational aspects of ministry, and one-on-one ask them to critique and evaluate and help you grow. These kinds of intentional steps are what are essential. Now, you can do that in the context of a degree program, and I hope that most people, especially younger listeners, would do that. But if that's not possible, you can still intentionally set out to read and reflect and study these issues and watch the personal growth take place as you let people speak into your life on these important issues.
And I think it's got to go hand in hand with this in order to recognize that it's important, and that you have to do that with intention. If you're listening to this and you're hearing that and you've heard it before and you're going, I don't know, then I would challenge you to check your priorities. To what
Yes.
extent do you value it as a priority to relate well to others? Given that we were talking about being missional earlier, given that one of the top, well, both of them are relational, right? One is relating to God, the other one is relating to everybody else. And so if that's not a priority to you, then I think that there's maybe even a challenge in the missional view.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm just thinking back to my developmental years in ministry leadership when I was in my 20s, for example. It was these kind of experiences of having reflection teams in my church, both at my master's and doctoral level programs. It was having some good friends named Gary and Rick and Keith in my first church who sometimes were pretty confrontive of me, but were always
Mm-hmm.
trying to say, Jeff, here's how you can relate better to people. These are some things you can do that will really strengthen you in these areas. And these guys were just church members who cared about me, but they saw
Yeah.
how I was struggling in these areas, and yet they wanted to point out not only my struggles, but how I could grow and help and develop. And then, frankly, for me, it involved some reading. For example, at one point, really studied the idea of developing listening skills, and I read books on that, and I went to a conference on that, and I was like, I got to learn how to be a better listener so I understand what people are saying to me and I can communicate more effectively. And I had never, when I'm here, I was 30 years old and I'd never had a class on how to listen. I
Yeah.
didn't even know they existed. Frankly, I spent most of my time learning how to be a communicator, meaning how to talk. I had been to classes on preaching and on teaching and on developing curriculum, and I had learned all this stuff about putting information out, but I had not learned very much
Yeah.
about taking information in. And so for me, it was just like an eye-opening experience to discover there are classes on this. There are actually books on listening. And when I
Yep.
read those, yeah, some of them were about counseling or about other kinds of areas of ministry, but it didn't take very much effort to apply them into my ministerial setting. So listen, man, there are resources out there. If you're struggling relationally in ministry leadership, you can get help and you can grow and learn.
Yeah. I was thinking through as we were describing that, it's living out James 1, learning how to listen well,
Yeah.
putting speaking maybe in the back seat and really focusing on the listening well and connecting with other people. Which, as somebody who teaches counseling on a regular basis, that's hitting me close to home here. I love it. And
Yeah.
so we're at that place. We're about out of time. This has been hugely valuable conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Iorg, for being on the show. For those of you watching, thanks for joining us, and we'll hope to see you next week.
Hey, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you so much.